I think the main willful blindness is to the nature of the PRC regime. You know, there's a desire to pretend that Chinese communist institutions are equivalent to Canadian institutions, whereas really the PRC regime is an integrated party, state, military, security, industrial complex. As Mao Zedong put it, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. And this principle has been explicitly reemphasized by Xi Jinping and codified into the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. So really all mainland institutions, whether they're government institutions, party institutions, or claim to be non-government institutions, they're all subject to the unified leadership of the party and coordinated to further the overall interests of power of the Chinese Communist Party. And so China's party, state, military, security, industrial complex seeks to further its strategic interests in Canada and other Western nations through a purposive policy of dissembling and subversion. Ivy talked about how Chinese Canadians are subject to menace and intimidation. The PRC regime insists that anybody of Han Chinese ethnicity, as descendants of the Yellow Emperor, must do whatever the Chinese Communist Party asks of them to further the agenda of the PRC motherland here in Canada, even if that means breaking Canadian law or violating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this puts, is a awful aspersion onto the character of ethnic Chinese who have absolutely nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party, that somehow or other Canadian mainstream believes that they are acting as agents for malign activities by this regime. It's, most awful sort of racism to impose that onto persons here in Canada who have come to Canada for our freedom and democracy. The essence of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work is in fact to induce elements, non-communist elements, to support the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And Chairman Mao and General Secretary Xi have referred to the United Front work as the Chinese Communist Party's magic weapon, Fabao in Chinese, or treasure of the Dharma as it is literally. The PRC has a lot of files on really all of us, whether you're of Han ethnicity or simply people who were to their attention, or people who were downloaded when 25 million personnel files were downloaded from sources in the U.S. government. And based on facial recognition and other sophisticated artificial intelligence surveillance techniques, these files are cross-referenced in massive databases. So the idea that the PRC diplomats that Sam shows as being photographed with triad leaders triad leaders engaged in criminal activities like drug smuggling, like money laundering, don't know exactly who these people are and what they do is just absurd. They know. In terms of the overall strategy, China urges democratic foreign governments like Canada's to adopt a policy of appeasement to PRC regime aggression, as Teng Biao referred to in his remarks. This is really through a tactical discourse of setting aside differences and seeking common ground, 求同存异 in Chinese language. What it amounts to is that Canada should ignore a wide range of concerns about Chinese regime behavior in favor of a promise by the Chinese regime of enhanced access to the Chinese market and reduction of Chinese non-tariff barriers to fair and reciprocal trade. And so we're supposed to ignore the espionage and interference operations by Chinese agents in Canada, and the fact that these are largely targeted towards persons of ethnic Chinese origin suggests that our government feels that they don't need to defend Canadians of Chinese origin to the extent as those of European origin. That we should ignore our security concerns over Chinese state acquisition of critical Canadian enterprises or Chinese state-associated firms like Huawei controlling the Canadian telecommunications through the 5G technology, or that we should ignore China's domestic policies of genocide and other violations of UN human rights covenants, including in Hong Kong, as Ben pointed out, that we should ignore China's expansion of territorial claims in the South China Sea and elsewhere, that we should ignore China's military menace of Taiwan, and China's engagement with the third world through the debt trap diplomacy and other abuses of international security laws, norms through the Belt and Road Initiative. Accepting this bargain that we separate our relations out, that our government show leadership and ignore Canadian public opinion, is justified by the pro-China Canadians who benefit personally from PRC sources as they put it, taking a long-term approach, having a nuanced, subtle, sophisticated, and mature perspective on Canada-China relations. But what it really amounts to is a betrayal of Canada's sovereignty, security, and the Canadian values that make our country so great. There is a powerful pro-PRC lobby in Ottawa and Vancouver and other Canadian capitals, mostly retired politicians who are on China-related boards, including Canadian companies and law firms that benefit from their dealings with the PRC. If these people take the PRC money or indirectly associated PRC money, it is naturally expected that they will support the interests of the PRC in Canada in return. Beijing seems confident that once Canadian public outrage fades over China's shameless flouting of the norms of international relations, that the Canadians who are on this PRC gravy train will continue to successfully, quietly lobby the Canadian government not to implement any measures that would inhibit the expansion of China's influence in Canada. So, you know, no foreign agent registry or Foreign Influence Transparency Act scheme for Canada. Basically, the United Front work is a sophisticated engagement of Canada, and the PRC always seems to end up on top. Hopefully, Sam's book will open up a lot of Canadian eyes to what is really going on. When Richard Fadden, the former director of CSIS, revealed that CSIS had concerns about senior Canadian politicians at the provincial and federal level who were under the influence of the Chinese regime, that he said that, you know, those people are not really to blame. It's the Chinese regime that's to blame. So I think that a lot of the Canadians who become complicit in acting as de facto agents for Chinese interests in Canada have been the subject of a very long-term, sophisticated engagement where they're gradually drawn into it. And by the time they realize, you know, what's expected of them, it's really too late to get out. And so I think that you know, the Canadians are obviously informed by a degree of naivete and also greed. And the Chinese United Front Work Department is very sophisticated in manipulating that and getting those people to start acting on behalf of the Chinese regime. And when it gets down to things like crowdfunding campaigns against Sam Cooper, you know, they find themselves forced to go along with this when really it violates Canadian principles of honesty and free debate. And I would finally just say that that the China Democracy Fund that Dean is chairman of is designed to try and provide funds for people who are being subject to lawfare by PRC-associated lawsuits to defend themselves against this kind of lawfare, so that people will not be cowed into self-censoring out of fear of ending up taking enormous financial loss if they're subject to spurious lawsuits over articles that are critical of the activities of the CCP regime here in Canada. So we've got your back, Sam.